Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to a Way Forward for Local Government. I'm Dan Mazmanian, the director of the Bedrosian Center and the Bedrosian Chair in Governance in the School of Policy, Planning and Development, and I'm going to be the panel moderator today. Your presence here is a clear reflection, I think, of the deep fiscal crisis we're facing in our local communities, yet I presume as well the commitment by all of us to find a path forward. As we began organizing this program today, we chose not to really glorify the problem so much. Turns out plenty of others are doing that for us. But to accept the new realities of a far more limited resources and capacities in the public sector and in the local level, and with this in view, to chart a new path forward in providing effective and efficient public services, as they say, where the rubber meets the road. As I believe you will hear from our panelists, this is not rocket science, but it calls for a new kind of political leadership, management, public understanding, a rethinking of expectations about the public sector. And this may be far more difficult, actually, than rocket science. Before we begin, no event like this happens without the help of many others, so I'd like to acknowledge the impressive group of those co-hosting the event with the Bedrosian Center today, the School of Policy, Planning and Development itself, the SPPD Alumni Association, the SPPD Graduate Policy and Administration Community, which is our wonderful graduate student association, the Southern California chapter of the American Society for Public Administration, and the Municipal Management Association of Southern California, and in particular, Maurice Turner for volunteering to help fund the reception that will immediately follow the event. Also, special thanks I'd like to extend to John Nicole and Dan Jordan and Bill Kelly and Mark Pizzano, who all helped organize the panel, and Bev Perry, who I saw, well, here's Bev in the back, Assistant Director of the Bedrosian Center, who has orchestrated the entire program. Thanks also to Glenda Silva, who's a Development Director at SPPD, who's handled all the reservations. Lastly, we're videotaping, and the event will be available on the SPPD YouTube, for which we owe thanks to Jan Peterson, who's SPDD's Communications Director, and Ben Dimapindan, who's our Communications Writer. So now to the panelists for a very brief introduction. Everybody, I hope, picked up a copy of the bios that are available out on the front table. But I'm going to start down the list just following the agenda before we turn to them. So in the order of the program, first, Bill Kelly. Bill, raise your hand. Bill specializes in the area of economic development, redevelopment, planning, and organizational management. He's been a managing principal at Urban Futures, Inc. since 2008, with a history in city management and community development. Tim Gage. After numerous years working on fiscal issues for the state legislative and executive branches, including being director of California Department of Finance under Gray Davis, Tim founded the Blue Sky Consulting Group, a public policy and economics consulting firm. Frank Benest. Frank. Until August of 2008, Frank served as a city manager at Palo Alto. He's a noted consultant and trainer on right-sizing public organizations, entrepreneurial government, civic engagement, leadership development, and succession planning. And Frank's a member of the National Academy of Public Administration. Maria Viramontes. Maria has served 9 years on the Richmond City Council and was appointed as chairperson of the Finance Committee to resolve the city's financial crisis during 2003 to 2005. She has served for over a decade on the Contra Costa Retirement Board, which is responsible for managing $4.5 billion in investments. And most important of all for today, her background is in finance, which is a rarity among elected officials, but essential in today's world. Richard Callahan. Rich is SPPD's Assistant Dean and Director of State Capital and Leadership Programs in our Sacramento Center. He directs the school's programs for nonprofit health executives, newly elected local officials, county executives, and legislative staffers from across the United States. He's also co-director of our new Executive Management of Leadership program. Tim Schaefer. Tim is the founder and principal of Magus Advisors, a consulting firm offering general public finance advice and transaction service for the planning, sale, evaluation, and administration of municipal bonds. He's practiced in the financial advisory business in California for 2 decades and has more than 40 years of experience in the municipal securities industry. Derek Okubo. Derek. Thank you. Derek is the Senior Vice President for the National Civic League. He's delivered technical assistance on a variety of issues for local and state governments, domestically and overseas, and has been a part of over 70 community-based planning processes around the community. He's the author of numerous articles, one of which you picked up outside, and handbooks on topics such as community engagement and participation, civic infrastructure, and fiscal sustainability. David Jansen. Last on our list, but very important to us. David has more than 30 years of experience working in the public sector at the local and state level. He stepped down as Chief Executive Officer for the County of Los Angeles in 2007. Prior to that position, he served the County of San Diego and the State of California as Director of the Department of General Services and Assistant Secretary of the Ag and Social Services agencies. David is the recipient of the 2003 National Public Service Award for Exemplary Public Leadership from the American Society of Public Administration and the National Academy of Public Administration, and the American Society for Public Administration. And he is a member of the Board of Counselors of our school. Thank you to all our participants. Now, we agreed to open the conversation today by asking our panelists to set the context for us. Each will provide their perspective, starting with the challenges, then the solutions, and then perspectives, as you can see from the program. If you have questions, I will try and recognize you. Just raise your hand during their comments or thereafter, and we'll see if we can get them answered and have some dialogue at that time. Also, at the end of the set presentations, we'll have an open Q&A for everyone. So that's the way we'll try and conduct. I hope to see you. May have to wave a little bit, but I'll keep my eye open. So first, to the challenges. Fiscal, organizational, interests, state and federal regulations and requirements, whatever it is. How did we get here? Bill Kelly.
Thank you. I've been in government since the early 1970s, and I think one thing that government has done is we have survived every previous disaster. Some of you who are old enough remember Prop 13, 1978. We took that hit. We all moaned about the impacts. We survived that. We have survived every single crisis in the past from a fiscal basis, but this is a whole new kind of problem. It's a national and international problem. Cities in the past, due to good council leadership, good city managers, made things work. But in my entire career, I don't recall a time when the future looks so bleak. The employment base is suffering for city employees. There's nothing going on the positive side. I mean, you can read in the Wall Street Journal, which is surprising. They're now talking about police cuts, fire cuts, when government gets in the Wall Street Journal in terms of issues and impacts. The economy is changing. You've got a mall operator going under and one mall operator going to want to buy them out. That changes the national economy. And I found this today in a shopping center publication. It's called The Recession Generation. That hasn't been talked about ever in terms of quality of life, style of government, things of that nature. I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill, and some of the quotes that he used in World War II are sort of timely for now. You know, people say, well, we're going to come out of the recession, but when? One of his quotes is, this is not the beginning of the end, it is the end of the beginning. We have a long way to go. There's meltdowns. As a consulting firm, we represent over 150 cities, and we keep saying this is not the bottom yet. You know, property tax down, sales tax down, retirement bill is going to slam next year. The challenge is suffering through all those things. Property taxes haven't hit bottom. There's one county up north where the assessor, who also happened to be running for re-election, managed to slam all the property taxes down. So all the cities in that county took a major hit for a political reason, absent the economy. And I guess if you look at it as a problem, you're the pessimist. Winston Churchill said, "I'm an optimist. It does not seem too much use being anything else." So I think the challenge in a short perspective is, how do you take this crisis and turn it around to a positive environment? There's a quote running around city managers in Orange County that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We have a chance with the elected officials, the unions for the first time, to understand that the old days are gone. They're not going to be repeated. Staff you have lost will not be replaced. I guess one of the quotes I had in thinking about today was that the old system of service delivery is gone. We'll never be able to duplicate that level of service we've had in the past, at least in the short run. For the first time, we brought unions to the table to negotiate modifications to benefits. That hasn't happened in a long time. Most often it's give to them, not take away from them. But I think one thing that the public hasn't understood yet is how their local governments run. To a lot of citizens, when you say if you're a full-service city, police, fire, etc., that 60 to 75% of that city budget is police and fire, they're shocked. But they'll be the first to say, but don't cut them. So if you say, well, what don't you cut? Well, don't cut recreation, don't cut library, don't close parks, don't cut anything and make it work. So the level of citizen participation in a lot of cases is pretty sad, and unless you play brinksmanship to them and actually cut things away, they don't react. One case in point in conclusion, talking about community input, I was city manager of Arcadia 14 years, did some major budget cuts. We cut police, we cut fire, we cut libraries, we closed parks, we cut street sweeping, we cut tree trimming. The one complaint we got after all that is, where's my street sweeper? Because they can feel and see and hear a street sweeper. Nothing else they felt. So I guess my point is, to conclude opening comments, are the old ways will not work for the future. This is the time for optimism, to be creative, be challenged, be provocative, be innovative. But as a leader of a government, you must lead with the city council. If the council and a manager aren't a team leading together, the turnaround will be extremely difficult, and the community, the employees, will suffer due to a lack of leadership. Thank you.
Good start, although not too optimistic. Tim, to you.
Well, I would offer a couple of thoughts following Bill's comments. It kind of falls to me to offer the perspective of state government. And before I get booed out of the room, let me say a few things. The state situation, as many of you know, I'm sure, partly because you've experienced the byproduct of the dire circumstances, is in fact pretty dire in Sacramento. And it's not going to get significantly better anytime soon. So how did we find ourselves in this situation? Well, the answer in one respect is obvious. It's by virtue of the collapse in the economy and the reduction in revenues that's being experienced, obviously not just at the local level, but the state level and even nationally. The difference, of course, with the federal government is they're in a position, and in fact had the responsibility of reacting to that kind of an economic circumstance in a different way than either state government or local government can. Neither state or local government can print money, and we don't have responsibility for stimulating the economy except to the extent that that's possible in the context of programmatic choices generally. But the overlay to that is, yes, the states lost, by virtue of the recession, from a forecast of revenues about $60 billion over 2 years. So call it $25 or $30 billion a year off of the state budget base of roughly $90 to $100 billion. The overlay to that is that the state missed the opportunity in the middle part of the last decade to really right the ship. We should have developed a rainy day reserve. We should have dealt with the underlying structural imbalance between revenues and expenditures. And we shouldn't have loaded ourselves up with debt that we in fact did. But we did. And so as a consequence, What would have been a very serious problem by virtue of the recession becomes even more serious, given the state's incapacity or inability to respond, given those underlying circumstances coming into the recession. So on that basis, the legislative analysts last fall forecasted that the state, absent any corrective action, would see an operating deficit of $20 billion a year for the next 5 years. So that's the context in which we talked this afternoon about local government. And of course, the picture for local government depends importantly on what's happening at the state level for a whole host of reasons. Again, some of which I expect we'll talk about this afternoon. So the challenge before us is significant. It means, as Bill said, coming to tough choices and tough decisions about where we're going to make reductions, where we can raise revenues for those programs that we deem critical. But it starts really with being smart about the problem, being honest about the challenges that we face. And the latter, unfortunately, is in relatively short supply in many quarters.
So now we have the local and the state. Frank.
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I was at a cocktail party with city managers. That's where we spend a lot of time bemoaning our fate a few months ago. And one of my colleagues came up to me and said, "Frank, you have an impeccable sense of timing. You retired as a city manager in August of 2008. And you have avoided, all the dreariness, all the negativity, all these daunting tasks that we have in terms of dealing with this terrible, terrible recession." And I said, my response was, you're right. Throughout my career, I've had 4 or 5 times where I've had to lead an organization during very difficult financial times. And it's overwhelming. You feel you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, not only all these citizens who depend on local government services, employees, their families. It takes immense energy, a lot of emotion. And so I'm glad I'm not doing that again. On the other hand, I said, you cannot make a greater contribution than being a leader in such a time. So, you can help an organization survive, and most of us are trying to help our organization survive, and hopefully, ultimately thrive. And so for those local government practitioners out in the audience, I want to commend you for taking on that challenge and hopefully helping our organizations survive and move forward. The challenge is very daunting, as has been alluded to, and the options are rather limited. We can raise revenue. We've raised most of our fees. We've gotten most of our special services up to cost recovery. Raising taxes, it's very difficult in this kind of environment. So raising revenue is a limited option. Securing take-backs from employee unions, as Bill mentioned, we need to do that. It's doable, but again, that's limited. Even if you two-tier a lot of our benefit programs, so the formulas are changed for new employees, that is going to take a time for us to realize those savings. You can, focus on economic development activities, but even if you're successful doing that, there's a lag before those revenues come in. And so we're some of us have been, now is the time to be very aggressive in terms of cutting costs, cutting programs. It's obviously very difficult when citizen demands remain stable if they don't increase. There's just so much neutralizing we can do in terms of our organizations. The ultimate choice, I believe, is really redesigning how we deliver services and what services we provide. And so later on, when we get to that part of the conversation, I'll have more to talk about what are some redesign strategies. But we really need to look at what is our service portfolios, and how do we deliver those services? I mean, the days when we were full service, responded to everybody's need, come down to City Hall and you got a problem, we'll respond. As Bill suggested, those days that are perhaps done. So we got to get a lot smarter and very much engage our citizens and the nonprofit sector as well as the profit-making sector in terms of finding new ways of delivering a modified portfolio of services. So I'll talk about that a little later.
That's appreciated. So we've heard the challenge in 3 different forms, but I think the tune is clear. It's going to be very difficult. Maria, of course, is joining us coming through such an experience already, and so we've asked Maria to comment a little bit about what she learned through the Richmond and maybe give us a little background on that Richmond experience, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you first let me thank you for coming today and for doing this today. I think this is really important, and I really want to encourage the elected officials in the room and those who've already made a commitment to serve in local government. That's really why I came today. I want to give you the good news. The good news is, yes, you can do this. Yes, you don't have to file for bankruptcy. Yes, you can fix this. And I sincerely mean that. And I can't put that in any better words than to let you know that it actually can be done. But I also want you to know that you will be a different community after it's done. You're not going to be the same. And there are going to be people who want to keep making it the same, but you won't be the same. In my city, I was elected in November of 2001. My first year on the council, we did not have cash flow reporting. The last 4 fiscal years, they had not turned in audits for 18 months to 24 months to have them approved. Vendors were not being paid somewhere between 6 months and a year. All those are signals to let you know that something is going wrong in your community. Okay? But it took a year to define what was going wrong. And what helped us define it, I want to hand you this tool today. Whatever level of government you're in, it pays off to do this. Our city council agreed when I put forward to hire an independent auditor who would report directly to us. And that sent us on our journey. And in March of 2004, we were told that we had less than 5 months of cash. We could not meet payroll. My city then had a budget that went from 380 to 400 million, of which less than 100 million was general fund discretionary money. We were 46 million in debt. We had already cut $10 million, but we had a structural deficit of 35 million, meaning no matter how much we cut, I was going to wake up July 1 and still be $35 million in debt. So what I would like to say is, one, you could make mistakes as were made in my community, or you could just be subject to, financial pressure as we were. It's a combination of both. We went through everything everyone else is going through, except now we're also dealing with the global recession. And in my community, we call it a depression. When you have 19% of your people unemployed, I'm sorry, we're facing a depression. Okay. Our process was really simple, and I want to say simple, but I put a handout to give you just a list of an idea of tasks that we had to do. But I really want to just give you one word, you. It all depends on you. Why? Yes, it's possible. Oh, for organize a team of people that are going to be responsible for helping you figure this out. And you utilize the leadership in your community. And leadership comes from everywhere. It comes from your community members. It comes from your unions. It comes from your council. It comes from your staff. It comes from experts and consultants you will absolutely need to bring in to help you work out this problem and the solution of recovery. I do want to say that in these, once we got the council to vote and recognize our problem and to go forward and not do bankruptcy, but solve our problem ourselves, our goal was in 18 months to be on our feet, and we met that goal. 18 to 24 months is what we told the council, and 18 months we were on our feet. We were in such bad condition, we were thrown off of Moody's, couldn't even get a credit rating. I want you to know we have rebuilt our city hall, the First Bay, for $110 million. In the middle of this, there are things you can do, there are many tools out there that can help you get back on your feet. 03, 04, 04, 05 were our crisis years. And then recovery, rebuilding our city to look different, happened the next 3 years, from 05-06 to 07-08. And in the middle of that, we hit this recession depression. After Prop 13 passed, prior to Prop 13, my city had 68 to 70,000 people in it, had 1,700 employees. When I was elected in 2001, there were 1,500 employees, 300 of them part-time. At the end of our budget crisis, before we began recovery, at 18 months, we had less than 700, and we had 108,000 people. We were a different city. And when we had conversations with our community about what we were going to look like to have a sustainable city, it was our goal to have 1,000 employees, basically one employee for every 1,000 population. And believe me, that's a small shift in a high urban city like ours with all the challenges we have. And at the break of this depression, we had 930. Today we have 930 staff. And we're going through it like other people. We may have to go back 100. We haven't quite decided yet. But we've been able to sustain all these 3 years because we put into place the sustainable qualities that we needed to have to thrive even in bad times. And that's the good news I want to share with you today. If you're willing to take leadership, if you're willing to face the truth of your situation, if you're willing to engage in all the conflict and conflict resolution and deal with your public and your unions and all the constituencies, you can come out of this a stronger, a better, a more viable city. And that's, if I can say anything else, it's that. It's doable. You can do this. And it's really worth doing.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we're going to come back to some more questions about Richmond, but meanwhile, we're going to move through the group and then we'll open this up. I believe it's Rich Callahan.
Okay, welcome. What I'd like to say is really focus on what the problem is. And the problem is we have the crisis we've designed for ourselves. We haven't gotten here by accident. We've gotten here by choices. Terry Moe, a political scientist, talks about, and his research focuses in on the question, are public agencies designed to succeed? When you think about it and you look at where we face ourselves in local government, and I say ourselves, I served as a township administrator for a town of 70,000 people and $40 million. When we look at the crisis we have, do we have the agencies designed to succeed? Or, as his dissertation student wrote, Amy Zygarde, who's over at UCLA, are public agencies designed to fail? I mean, but these are design choices. And I think the first choice we've made societally to get us to this position is a failure to invest in leadership. We assume leadership can kind of happen. But leadership, effective leadership in local government, in law enforcement, in military, in higher education doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. It happens by investment. And we haven't done that societally. We've done it and we've recognized it in the military. We make significant investments in United States Military Academy at West Point, Naval Academy, Air Force. We make that investment in law enforcement. ICMA looks to make that investment. But societally, can we really say that the people that we make it in our finance directors, but they make it in themselves. Tim Gage goes to Berkeley, gets his master's of public policy, works his way up. But as we look at that investment in leadership, have we really made the investment for the stakes, for the amount of money that's on the table? In terms of who this problem affects, I think it's much wider than what we're saying today. It's not us in this room. It's not us in California. I mean, we've designed a problem. We've walked away from an investment that affects our future, the future of our children and their children. That's a fairly significant failure of investment. So we'll hear more on the problems, but I think what we're here today is really to say what are the solutions. And so briefly, what I'd like to put out on the table and build on some of the ideas here is the solutions are investment in leadership. Okay, the Richmond story doesn't happen without leadership. We don't get to, leaders bring strategy. Strategy brings clarity. I think as we look at the problems that we face in this fiscal crisis is really a lack of clarity about choices made, whether deliberate or not deliberate. So leadership creates strategy that creates outcomes. One of the failures is we've really failed to celebrate when leadership makes a difference. How often do we talk about the difference that Tom Bradley made for the city of LA? Rarely, right? Rarely. The success of the Olympics, the success of transportation, really the building of LA as we know it. How often do we talk about John Dyer? Few of us know who he is. He's the guy who figured out how to navigate and negotiate the federal funding system to bring what is now the rail system to downtown LA. How often do we talk about, now that she's retired, Liz Hill and the leadership she brought to have credible numbers in the face of a variety of budgetary gimmicks, none brought by Tim, of course. He's a fellow Red Sox fan, so I can only say good things. All right, we're having a tough season, so be gentle on both of us. All right.
Tougher than you
But
thought.
Liz Hill, year in and year out, bringing clarity, bringing credibility, bringing accountability to the processes in Sacramento. How often do we learn from that example? How often do we invest in these skills? How often do we invest in skills, leadership skills, that bring people together around core values instead of divide people around smaller differences or ideological differences? How often do we work through and celebrate examples where we've gotten traction on intractable policy issues? Issues that no one can move forward for in years. You think of the Base Closure Commission. Think of the work Dr. Ken Kaiser did at the Veterans Health Administration. There's a range of examples to learn from, and societally, institutionally, communities, organizationally, and personally, we have these opportunities to learn from these examples, to take these solutions, to crosswalk them to this fiscal crisis, and that's what I propose that we do to move forward and gain traction as we go forward.
Well, you've added to the richness of the coming conversation, Rich. Thank you. We're going to turn to questions of finance now just a little bit. Tim.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Center for inviting me. My main contribution to this is as a practitioner, somebody who assists our state and local governments when it comes time to borrow money. So I have that perspective. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that the markets are open and functioning. The bad news is that they're opening and functioning on life support. Many will default to a mental state that says that bankruptcy has to be the answer for our local governments. And I categorically reject that. I don't think that is, in most instances, a particularly wise idea. I also don't think it's as inevitable as many pundits would argue it is. A municipality, short of disincorporation, can't go out of business like a commercial enterprise can. There is no creative destruction model the way there is in a commercial enterprise. And for that reason, a bankruptcy, when we lay aside the term and talk about bankruptcy as a solution to these problems, I think is to trivialize the importance that our state and local government, particularly our local governments, play for their stakeholders. I think that bankruptcy is not an option because, number one, try to debunk some of the myths. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to try to practice bankruptcy law here for those of you who are lawyers. But an involuntary bankruptcy is not permitted for a local government. Unlike a commercial enterprise where the commercial enterprise's creditors can come together, create a critical mass of thought, and place the company into bankruptcy, there is no equivalent of that in municipal government. Secondly, there's no such thing as a liquidation of a municipal government. We can't create a bankruptcy estate, sell off all the assets, chop up the bankruptcy estate, and then hand it to hand it to the creditors. Unless we want to hand them, I guess, one police car at a time, but I haven't even figured out how to do that. What a bankruptcy judge can do, of course, is impose a plan of adjustment on the municipality's creditors. And finally, the municipality's powers to conduct its business are not greatly curtailed in a municipal bankruptcy, for the most part. Again, unlike their commercial counterparts, where the bankruptcy judge gets to make a lot of law, and as one of my friends who's a bankruptcy lawyer says, and sometimes it's not very good law, in a commercial bankruptcy setting, the powers are much more limited. So what's the answer? If bankruptcy isn't the answer, let's say something positive. Well, first, your lenders, for those of you who are public agency folks, your lenders are not looking for miracles. They get it. They know what's going on. They see it all across the country with your counterparts to whom they've loaned money and to whom they are contemplating lending additional money. They get it. They aren't looking for miracles. What they are looking for, and I'm going to riff off of something that Rich just said, is they're looking for clarity. They're looking for clarity and transparency. And doesn't that all back up to the point that Rich just made, and that is that good leadership will produce clarity, and clarity will produce outcomes, and that sounds like a riff on what Maria has talked about and Bill and Frank before. So what to do going forward? Well, in terms of platitudes, start with, those of you who are Stephen Covey fans, begin with the end in mind. Secondly, big rocks first. And thirdly, take it one day at a time. That means at a time when you may be disinclined to be very open and forthcoming about the condition of your agency, this is the time to be over the top in being open and transparent and forthcoming about it. Because to do so will build the credibility necessary to get existing lenders to work with you, and frankly, to get those lenders who, even in spite of that, will still lend you money to work with you on a program that works for you. Secondly, recognize that the fix, as Maria has described, it will be a long time coming. I'm not an economist. I'm surrounded by economists here, but what people who are far brighter about this than I tell me is that the recovery of sales tax dollars, property tax dollars, those dollars that are denominated on other types of economic activities like transient occupancy taxes, for example, UUTs, may take years to recover. And that's why I go back to that conversation about big rocks first. By way of tactical responses, in closing, I would just say that as we witness the national and international economy going through the throes of this deleveraging, this paying down of debt that is so painful, we need to recognize that that's going to have to happen in some of our local agencies too. And while that may not be the seminal cause of the problem, and it's not, structural deficits are, it will gain a lot of attention because there will be an urge on the part of some who want to practice bumper sticker politics here to say, repudiate the debt, file for bankruptcy, and then we don't have to address the issues that require the leadership, the courage, the clarity, and the outcomes that the other panelists have described.
Thank you, Tim. And I'll just say one of the prompts for this panel was many people coming to me saying, so Dan, let's advocate for bankruptcy. And so I appreciate you clarifying that point. It may not be a solution at all in the public arena. So then I want to turn now to Derek, who brings us a perspective from well beyond our local and, in fact, even statewide perspective. I hope many of you picked up, if not all of you, picked up the outline from the National Civic League. But Derek, maybe you can tell us about your survey of what's going on around the country.
Sure. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm from Denver. Our national headquarters for the National Civic League is based in Denver. And most of the work that we do is not Colorado-centric. It's all over the country. And I've had the pleasure of working in a number of communities of all sizes, from coast to coast, north and south, and in the heartland, etc. So one of the things what happened was last fall, we had a board meeting, and Mark Pisano, who is a member of our National Civic League board, brought up the issue of the economic crisis and how it is impacting and potentially forever will impact and change the way that local government works. Well, that sparked a large discussion on our board, who comes from all over the country, representing all the different sectors that make up our communities. And so after that meeting, I thought, well, I wonder what people are saying around the country. So what I did is I put together a list of managers, city and county managers that I knew from all over the place in municipalities of all sizes. And so I called them up and arranged interviews with them to see how the economic crisis was manifesting itself in their communities, and what they were doing, what they were thinking about, to what degree was it impacting. Well, the findings that I had coming out of there was that the economic crisis has impacted every municipality. It just depends to what degree. So what started happening in my head is, okay, well then, why is it that maybe some it didn't impact as much as others, as far as a lower degree of negative impact? And I'm going to focus more on what I found as far as what people were doing that seemed to help them as far as those issues were concerned. Well, one of the main things was, Rich, I think you mentioned choice. Well, there was, in every community that had a lower degree of negative impact, they had in place some conservative or frugal fiscal approaches as far as how they dealt with their finances. So, of course, when I heard that, as far as the examples that they were having as far as how they were setting aside certain revenues, a certain percentage, and saving that, they were looking at different ways as far as revenue generation and taking the time to identify where the revenues were coming from. I said, well, where did that start? And they said, well, it was because of a crisis that we experienced back in 1990s or 9/11 when it happened. It revealed, if you remember, 9/11 had a large local economic impact for a lot of communities too, as far as sales taxes. Those that made the choice to learn from those past experiences and incorporate changes as far as how they went about doing their business, those were the ones that when we found ourselves in this crisis going on right now, they were impacted to a lesser degree. The other thing that I found is that those communities that had incorporated sustainability practices earlier in the decade were also those that were impacted to a lesser degree. And that makes sense, when you think about it, because you're talking about they were anti-sprawl. They were looking at more of the urban boundary planning. As a result, they didn't have infrastructure that was extending out to these different areas. They didn't have the extra service costs that went out to these different areas. They were focusing, the transit costs, the energy costs, things like that were also impacted. The other thing is that what we found is that there was another part of the sustainability practice was grow local, buy local type of a mindset. And because of those folks that had that, their sales tax revenues, people were still spending money, but they were spending it differently. And so as a result, those communities that just had the high-end shops, they were losing revenue because most of the money was being spent on the middle, medium range, until the lower range type of stores. So those communities that had the buy local, grow local, buy local, and also the diversified retail were the ones that were hurt less because their sales taxes, even though people were spending money differently, it was staying within that community. One of the other things that the communities that were impacted less, they had a history of community engagement, or they had methods and the processes in place for community engagements. Thus, when they needed to come together and address these tough issues as far as fiscal sustainability, a lot of those networks were in place, the trust was there, they can convene folks to come together and talk about these tough issues that they're facing in their communities. There was a strong communication mechanisms internally within City Hall and across departments, and there was also strong communication mechanisms with the community as well. Maria was talking a lot about, and you'll talk more about this, as far as the time that the people took as far as to meet individually with each council member, to meet individually with department heads, to meet individually with the different perspectives of the key folks and contacts in the community were so key to be able to communicate the challenges and to convene folks to start to look at the solutions. What are the priorities? What are the options that we have? Incredibly important as far as that civic infrastructure was concerned. And lastly, a lot of the ability to step over boundaries as far as municipalities working together as far as sharing services, whether it was dispatch, whether it was fire, public safety type services. Those communities that had that ability and those relationships with other municipalities to work together with them on those things were also key factors as far as that was concerned. One of the key things, to wrap this up as far as my piece, as far as one of the things that you heard from everybody has been leadership. You know, as far as the key, as far as the leader, and Maria is a great example of that leadership that's willing to take the risk. And so one of the things, just a few characteristics, because when I asked, one of the things that always came up was that there was always at least one person that played a key role in being able to step out and convene folks and say, folks, we got to address this. They had certain characteristics. One, they were a good communicator. They took the time to go to however many people they had to start the discussion, saying, I need you there at the table. I don't have all the answers, but maybe if we come together, we have to look at this jointly in order to come up with solutions. So they were a good communicator. They were a convener. They had that long-term point of view. You know, they were looking down the road. They were realizing that they weren't going to solve it overnight, that this was going to be something that they were going to have to look at down the road. But they had that long-term vision. Conflict. They realized that conflict, they feared conflict as much as anybody else a lot of times. But they also realized that conflict, they couldn't let conflict, the fear of conflict, stop them from addressing the issue. And so as a result, they realized it was a natural part of the process and they needed to just work through it. And then lastly, just the problem, we've talked a lot about the problem identifier versus problem solver. One of the key things is that it's important that we identify the problem, but not stop there. You know, we can just go over it in ad nauseum, but we have to be problem solvers, not merely problem identifiers. And so the key leaders were those who would take the time to look at the what the problem was, but then focus as much time and even more energy on the ways in which to solve it and working together in order to do that.
Derek, that's fantastic. It's obviously a rich body of knowledge you're bringing to us, and it's not just about our own locally triggered problems. This is really a national issue.
Absolutely, it is.
We're going to turn for just one more set of comments, and we're going to open up to Q&A and have a broader conversation. We're going to turn to David Jansen, who actually, in my personal view, was a role model of that kind of leadership while serving our county, which is a huge county, some 90,000, sometimes I hear 100,000 employees with a whole range of services that needed to change and did change under David's guidance. But David, looking at this issue, How can you help us appreciate it?
I'm sorry that you introduced me that way. I really am. I've listened to all.
I want to steer you away from what otherwise would have been your tendency, David.
Well, but you didn't succeed.
Oh.
I think the problem is much greater than the economic problem. I don't think the economic problem is that big a deal. The problem is the state of the nation. And the state of the nation scares the hell out of me. I don't know about you. It certainly impacts the economic, but somewhere in our recent history, we went from being citizens of this country to taxpayers. Now all you hear from any elected official is, what do the taxpayers want? It's not, it was Kennedy, right, that said, ask not what you can, your government can do for you, ask what you can do for you. The only time since that we pulled together as a nation was in 9/11. For a short period of time, Americans had trust and belief in their government again. It didn't last. People are angry. They're angry at their government. Rich has started talking, and it's a political scientist viewpoint of it. It's not an administration. Our government system, the structure designed in the Constitution, is not designed to handle the kinds of problems we're facing today. And I have a question about whether it can successfully do that, given the nature of our constant elections, constant campaigning. Governance is about finding common ground. Campaigns are about differences. And if you're campaigning constantly, then you're playing to a specific audience. And the audience is becoming more and more narrow for whatever reason. So there is no incentive anymore to find the common ground in the country. San Diego County's motto is, the noblest motive is the public good. I think it's very hard to find where that exists in this country. It isn't in the public, it isn't in business. Business isn't in for the common good. There's no social interest that I see anymore in business. There used to be in this country, there's not anymore. Other than that, things are great. I don't want to be working in a Chinese mine. That's the latest thing, is you're going to be working in a Chinese mine. We may be. President Obama was elected by a huge number of people. Within 1 year, his approval rating fell to 46%. 46%. Didn't even last a year. People are so angry and upset. And I think it is in part because government cannot get the job done. This is very broad. Obviously, there are specific governments that can do very well. But as a generalization, the structure is not designed to be efficient. People like efficiency. They like the trains to run on time. It isn't happening. They get frustrated with it. In California, we have been in a fiscal crisis for 25 years, ever since Prop 13. The state wouldn't even talk about it until the 80s. Then they started talking about it, and then it was, when is it going to be fixed? When is the state-local problem going to be fixed? Well, we always thought it would be during a crisis. That was 91. Nobody did a damn thing. Said, okay, that didn't work. How about good times? Well, good times, right, came in the late 90s. Nothing. They didn't do anything. The structural problems are still there. People don't talk about the structural problem. And my fear, frankly, is that we are going to end up with a national initiative, the way we have in California, which has totally screwed up the state. See, I'm retired. I live in San Diego. I don't give a shit anymore. So I can say what I really believe. The technology exists now for every person to sit at home and vote on every agenda item in the Richmond City Council. And you know what that means? We don't need the Richmond City Council. We don't need representative government anymore in this country, because we can do it ourselves. That's what California did in 1911. And I can see the more angry and frustrated people get, the more they're going to start saying, I know how to solve this. Just let me have a vote. Other than that,
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
It's a propitious moment to open this up for questions and comment from the audience. I'm going to do that. Please feel free to direct them at individuals or collectively. And please ask questions if you can. I know there's sometimes a statement that people want to make. I'll try and repeat the question so we can pick it up on the camera. Sir.
And introduce yourself, please.
I'm Terry Cooper. I'm a member of the faculty of this school. I just want to say that David Jansen has just told the truth. I heard across this panel leadership, civic engagement, resolving conflict. Why are we so conflict averse? That's my first question. Why are we so reluctant to engage the public in what aspires to be a democracy? Why have we so ignored leadership when we look back to our founding era and find ourselves inspired by the leadership of that time? We will never solve these financial problems without addressing those problems. Trust has been declining in this government at all levels, most at the federal level, but now at the state and local level since the 1960s, and it's in the basement. Unless we address these problems, as David has said, the rest is not going to happen. People are increasingly alienated, and what will happen is increasing social disruption and resistance.
Thank you for the question, Professor Cooper. Do we have other questions? Sir, please introduce yourself.
Maurice Turner, State of Newport Beach. I have a question for anyone to answer on the panel. Is there any way that government can truly take advantage of the rise in at least the general public's interest and engagement using social networking mediums to at least get people closer to the table, if not actually making some decisions and providing their input to what's going on?
I appreciate the use of social engagement, social media, to facilitate or encourage that kind of engagement that we have heard from several of the panelists. Who'd like to take that on? Frank?
Well, I'm a big fan of civic engagement. I thoroughly agree that the only way to begin to address some of our problems is to engage our communities as well as our employees and trying to confront the problems that we have. Now, the problem I have with social media, if it only produces public opinion, this one shot in time, this is my opinion, which is often ill-informed, biased, based on limited information, no commitment to solving the problem, I'm pessimistic about that. To the extent that it can support public judgment, where you have these virtual environments where people not only get some information, they get a chance to ask questions, to clarify the information, they hear different perspectives, they commit to working on the problem, so they're part of the solution. I think social media can complement, not substitute for, but complement some of the traditional face-to-face engagement that we have. It is quite clear from the work that Derek has done and from all our experiences as practitioners, unless we engage people as partners in this problem, there's no chance in hell of us confronting our problem.
So Maria, you didn't solve all the problems, but you did a lot in Richmond. What level of engagement took place there? What did it require?
We had structured engagement in our city as just a lifestyle in our city prior to our situation. So it was easy to move into an engagement process. But we did use technology a little bit. We posted a website to give people updated information, especially when we were talking about cuts. Our mayor used an electronic system where every household was phoned to let them know when we were going to be doing community outreach meetings in their neighborhood to talk about our fiscal crisis. So basically we use it as an information tool to let people know about meetings. We made a decision not to engage in networking by computer in our community. And I would say, even though this is 5 years later from that decision, I would make that decision again. And I'll share with you why. It would be an injustice in our community. 40% of the people in my community do not have access to a computer, are not computer literate. We would hear from the educated and the wealthy. We would not hear from anyone else. Either the middle class who are too busy working to get to a computer and the poor just don't have it. So that just would not have been the medium for us. But I agree with his statement wholeheartedly. Twittering our way is not going to bring the kind of social and moral consciousness and courage a community needs to solve these problems. It will not happen by Twitter. As a matter of fact, blogs were on the other side, confusing, alienating, attacking, giving misinformation campaigns. We had political candidates and wannabe candidates and next year assembly member candidates and I wish I was in Congress candidates and, advocates of all colors, framework, political framework out there undermining everything that we were doing as a city. I want you to understand that's real. And the conflict resolution issues, the engagement was so serious that I had a bulletproof vest. Our council members were handed a bulletproof vest, okay, when we entered some hearings. In fact, we had them for a whole year in our council on the floor. And there were reasons for it, okay? So when people say, why are we sort of risk averse? We got some angry people in this world. We have some emotionally unstable people too, which situations like this bring out. I'll just share with you a really quick story so you'll understand. 15 months into this process, I told my husband, I will not eat in any restaurant in our community. If we're going to go to the show and eat somewhere, we are going somewhere else. Because everywhere I went, to give you a concept, I had 8,500 emails. And as chair of the budget committee that was doing these cuts, I'm just a local, supposed to be part-time council member, okay? I said, we're going to go outside because wherever I was, someone would come up to me and say, you laid off my grandson. You just cut my swimming team for my child. You know, whatever. Okay. But this one day I walked into my local store and I'm looking down at the shampoo rack like this. And I look over and I see this person running towards me and I don't have my distance glasses, but what I can tell is blood is all over the front of this person's white clothes. And I take a deep breath and I want you to know, I said a Hail Mary, because I said, this is it, And I looked over and I reached as calmly as I could. I reached out my hand because this person was screaming out my name. And I reached over to handshake the person with a very calm voice. And it wasn't until the person was completely up to me, I realized it was the butcher. Maria Garamontes, I am so happy you're here and happy to meet you. I want to thank you for what you're doing.
Meanwhile, you had a heart attack.
So Maria, as you right up to the punchline, I'm thinking we left one characteristic out, which was courage.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to add courage and a sense of humor.
Yes, absolutely. Have to.
Can I just say something real quick? What I found with the social media, it's great for sharing information, but it's not great for making decisions. If you want to make decisions, there's nothing that can beat getting the people there to look each other in the eye, ask each other the tough questions that need to be asked, and work it out together. I mean, that's how that trust gets developed, is by doing that.
Yeah, you're not going to develop trust over social media.
Yeah.
What was that, Frank? We didn't hear you.
I said it's very difficult. I agree with Derek. It's very difficult to develop a sense of trust, over the social media mechanisms that we have.
And then you have to address the issue of scale, though.
Right.
They're both talking about small communities.
Right.
What do you do in Los Angeles, where there are 3.6 million people, to try to come to any kind of resolution about significant problems? It's on a different scale.
Yeah. And in all sincerity, David, how do we get to the national level of which you were talking
and
about?
even greater.
Yeah. Question here. Please introduce yourself.
Henry Kaiser. I served with our local neighborhood council in the historic Highland Park area for about 8 or 9 years. I'm currently treasurer with the council. We have a brand new council coming in soon now, thank God. The city controller, who does a lot of audits of the city, how independent do you think that is? Is that independent enough to be able to really provide information to the council for them to be able to act on?
We have a director of finance in our city, which is under the control of the city manager. He hires and fires them, okay? What I was talking about was an independent auditor that reports directly to the elected body. Doesn't own him, he doesn't have to go through the city manager and own. Now, this is a very controversial thing. Berkeley has an elected auditor process. I didn't It works well for them, but I don't really like that because it becomes political. I think it's important, though, to have an independent auditor function. My council was very split. They supported me unanimously during the budget crisis to have an independent auditor come in and report to us. After we were doing well in recovery, they wanted to get rid of the independent audit function. And I will tell you, my city manager doesn't like it. Most city managers don't, okay? What we have morphed into now is an independent audit process. We contract with someone and we select 3 departments with 3 issues a year to audit, both fiscal audit and performance audits. And it's based on issues and concerns that the council has. I still think it would have been better to keep a pure independent auditor, but that was a compromise made on my council. This is the problem of when you're doing well, people forget what got you there. They forget all the great practices that you put into place for fiscal responsibility, social responsibility, and they move away from them as times get good. That's one of the sad songs in this this moment.
Bill, if I could pursue that with you a little bit, is this the kind of advice you give to cities that you're helping, this independent auditing?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept of the outsider looking in. As a former city manager, I was sort of, that's good, thank you very much, I'll take your advice and move on. Council's looked at it. It's a variable. I think that the test of the outside looking in is what the purpose is. If they're simply hired to make a report and then walk away and nothing happens, that's not a real outside looking in. That's just a game being played for political purposes. It's whitewashing the problem versus doing something serious. And I think that the progressive cities, and unfortunately there's not a lot of them, are looking for all levels of input, not just the outside in, inside out, but community input. But I want to go back to something as talked about earlier about the outside looking in and citizen participation. When things are good, no one cares about your city. Streets are swept, trees are trimmed, things are fine. When you have a crisis, we have a society now, the book on bowling alone, they don't have time for their government. They don't have time for their churches. They don't have time for service clubs. We're in a different societal atmosphere now. 2 parents working, kids playing sports. Government is the last thing they worry about. And I think that government has to change how they approach that communication out through all sorts of communications. I mean, I can't tell you how many times there's a budget hearing and no one shows up. If you discuss the cat leash law, man, that room is full because they can touch that. So an auditor's a great thing to do, but also it's just a bunch of numbers. It doesn't connect to the citizenry. And until they can connect to what's going on, you're not really accomplishing the true change.
Questions? Ma'am.
Hi, I'm Katie Wilson, and I'm a consultant to local government. I'm a former city manager and department head for many Southern California cities for over 20 years. So there were a couple things that Mr. Bennett and Mr. Kelly said that if anybody wants to expand on it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And first on the engagement with the community, I want to point out that work furloughs aren't helping that process. I think not being able to reach anybody at city on Friday, I know as a consultant to local government, it makes my day great on Fridays. I can get a lot of work done because my clients aren't around. But as a resident of the city, it's very frustrating. But Mr. Bennett and Mr. Kelly, you both said something about redesigning services and the expectations that service delivery, the old system of service delivery is gone. And I'd love to hear your insights of what you think the new service delivery is going to look like, because my clients are all struggling with that right now.
Well, as I mentioned, I think the greatest opportunity is with service redesign and what we call shared services. And let me just tick off sort of just a brief menu of sort of kinds of approaches that I see a lot of my colleagues and clients working on. One is, of course, organizational restructuring. County of San Mateo just merged their public health department and the medical center, so a lot of our governments are looking at that. A second approach is sort of shared equipment, joint purchasing. City of Palo Alto and Mountain View share a ladder truck, a fire ladder truck, instead of having 2 fire ladder trucks. A third area is the consolidation of service efforts through joint powers authorities and contractual agreements. 2 fire departments, or 2 cities forming a JPA to have 1 fire department. San Mateo County has just developed a JPA to deliver training services to all the local governments in the county. Some governments on the peninsula up in the Bay Area are offloading their police departments and contracting with other agencies. So there's a whole realm of consolidations and shared services. Then, service partnerships is another area where, for instance, supporting parent groups or nonprofits to take over an after-school program or an aquatics program. A fifth area is some governments have gotten quite entrepreneurial, taken a service area and spun that off and are now selling those services to other organizations and raising dollars to cover their costs and subsidize their own program. City of Palo Alto, we sold IT services to 7 other governments. And then a final one I just want to mention is self-service to eliminate costs. And you see some of that in, of course, our libraries with kiosks. Even in some governments, they're even allowing business owners now to do simple self-inspections. So I think what I'm talking about is really there's no one silver bullet. Not one of these strategies will solve the problem. But by looking at a mix of service redesign strategies, I think we can still maintain a core set of services in our portfolio of services and continue to meet our mission. The 3 essentials, it gets back to leadership again. We not only have to inventory some of these opportunities, but we really need champions. None of these things happen without champions who have a sense of passion and will and are willing to cross those boundaries where they don't have any control. And then, to any one of these strategies require engagement of employees, citizens, other partners. And so it really, to make any of these happen, it all gets down to leadership.
I'd like to add to that. I think, not to duplicate what Frank said, but I think the leadership goes back to the city council. Too many communities all want to have their own fire department or police department or whatever they always have. And it's very expensive typically. This, I mentioned earlier, Christ, a terrible thing to waste. This is a time to reinvent what you do. Police departments, everybody wants their own SWAT team and helicopter. Why? Because everybody had their own before. It's a different world. You don't need all those things. You melt it down, decide what is your critical mission by department. And in tough times, that should be the focus, be it a library or a police department. Can you afford to have officers on high school campuses when you can't get officers in black and whites? What's important? And then you start sharing resources. I think Frank made some excellent examples. Why does every city have to recruit for firemen and do it on the firefighter, and do it by themselves? When you have 3,000 applicants for 2 jobs and each city's doing the same thing, that's utter nonsense. Can you be more collaborative and focus and do regional government by cities? I'm not talking COG, but multitask these operations and start saving money. And furloughs don't work on Fridays.
Anybody else want to follow up on this?
Might just mention, about 20 years ago, Gabler and Osborne wrote a book, In Pursuit of Excellence, that talked about government should steer and not row. And I've never forgot that terminology because it resonated with me, that it is much easier for an elected official and a manager not to have to deal with all of the unionized employees that we have, where you can manage somebody else. And you don't have to, the retirement debts, the health debts, retiree health. Let me tell you, the current problem at the state is minor compared to that, and every single jurisdiction has it. And it's not solvable, so you just keep rolling it forward. Anyway, I think it's not contracting out as much, because I'm not wild about contracting out particularly, but the concept of you're more steering the organization than doing it yourself always resonated with me.
We had this conversation, understand, if you had 1,500 employees and now you have less than 700, are you the same? Are you going to be able to do everything that you did before? Heck no. So in the community, there had to be conversation about what are we going to look like And if our goal at the end of the line was to have a sustainable 1,000 employees to serve our community, we weren't there yet. How are we going to get there? And what departments were we going to keep? What services, what constitutes a core service that a full-time employee should have? And where could people tolerate contracting out? Or where could people tolerate regionalism to be the answer? Okay? And we had those conversations in our community. I will have to say, I come from the Bay Area. We are a unionized community, okay? We love our unions. You won't live in Richmond long if you say you don't like unions, you know, okay? So to have conversations with our unions to say, how are you going to look in the Bay Area that we were going to contract out? I mean, that's like as explosive. I can't even think of any other word I could lay out on the table that would be as explosive as contracting out. But I want you to know we made those fundamental changes. And we went through debates. One was rolling out our library, maybe into a regional library. It was a conversation for 2 years. We ended up not doing it, but hey, we went out there and looked at it. We talked to a private foundation to fund a planning process for us to figure out how we could reconfigure our park and recreation department. It was huge, huge. And everyone had their own neighborhood community center. We have 17 centers in your city. Fremont has 3 times the population we have. They have one centralized community recreation center for the entire city. We had 17 in a community of 100,000. People could walk the distance, and you tell them you're going to close down their neighborhood center that they had for 50 years. You think about what that's like. We did make decisions on special district, landscaping and lighting districts that were contracted out work. Occasionally, we let our employees compete with private sector for those contracts. We made a decision to keep a very small core of public works workers. We have a core team in our public works department. The rest of our roads is contracted out based on income, because that was one department where money goes up and down because of the state. It's very unpredictable. We went through a huge dialogue on changing sewer structure in our water reclamation district, which we used to deal with. We have 3 sewer structures in our city. One of them now is a private-public partnership. Another is a joint powers authority taking over more issues with another public-funded district. But every one of these conversations were tough conversations, real conversations. People had opinions about them. And it brought us better into balance. One day we will have consolidated fire districts, but I will just have to tell you that was not a conversation we could have in the middle of our budget crisis. It just wasn't.
Tim, you were going to say?
With this panel, I feel a little bit like I'm about to talk to birds about how to fly, but this is my perspective standing down in the well and speaking to our elected officials. In those organizations where the elected officials respect one another, deal with one another in a very respectful way, in a very business-like way, it is my experience as a practitioner that those tend to be very highly functioning institutions. Right. Sometimes that leadership comes because the managers encourage them to that, help them with their team building. Sometimes it occurs organically. It is probably as unique as there are the number of organizations where it occurs. But I'm sad to say that that's in the minority. And I'm reminded of what the real bitter truth is, spoken to the California Assembly and Senate Joint Budget Committee by our currently sitting state treasurer last spring, when he said to the assembled committee, make up your mind right now that if you're going to solve this problem, you won't be back here next January. If you really are going to solve the problem, you just have to give it up and recognize that you may not come back. And if you can attack the problem that fearlessly, then perhaps there will be answers.
We work for a lot of cities as consultants for economic development. And you ask a developer, would you come to this city? And their first comment is, how stable is the city council? People won't invest in communities that have political instability, city managers coming and going. The average, and Frank helped me, the average tenure of city managers in California is 4 years.
3.8.
3.8. And the average council tenure isn't a whole bunch better because it's a stepping stone to higher office. So the instability is critical to the failure. The stability brings forth the leadership and change. And I think you're right, Tim. There's not enough stable city councils to allow communities to survive and get out from under. I think your presence here today is an indication of your organization's concern about fixing the problem, not just going forward in the dark days and not solving it. Your organization spent time to send you here to think about what to do versus what's going on and accepting it. I think that's the difference in leadership.
If the instability is one of the issues, what are the keys to stability? And I'm just throwing that out.
You're not going to answer that?
Yeah.
No, you can answer that, Derek.
No, just because, it is something that, if the instability is more commonly the norm, then what do we need to do in order to turn that around?
You have to give up term limits. You just have to. I'm sorry. It has destroyed It has destroyed California politics. If there's any one policy that has destroyed our politics, that has been it. And it's destroyed it because, one, it's made it now a politics of ambition. It takes you 2 years to figure out how to find the bathrooms in the Capitol, much less understand all the budget things. We have people running for assembly who never even sat on city councils or county board of supervisors or school boards. They just get up, put their pants on and go run. They don't know anything. I'm sorry. I would like one person to stand up here right now and tell me you'd be willing to go in that room for surgery on your brain with somebody who has never done an operation in their life. Why can't people have respect for the institution of government as they do everything else? It's ridiculous. When governments don't work, people die. I mean, this is our community we're talking about. And we ought to have more respect for it as an institution. I don't care what party you come from. We all have to respect the institution that saves people's lives and builds the quality of our life. And that's really what it's about. So you got to have people with a little experience when they walk in there. It makes all the difference in the world.
Oh, I see a bunch of hands here.
Kathy Warner, City of Whittier, Mayor Pro Tem, and our council is stable, but we don't always agree. As council members, we have responsibilities to sit on other boards and agencies. I'm our city's representative to SCAG, and one of my responsibilities is to sit on the committee that deals with housing, economic development, and transportation. So we're spending a lot of time focusing on how Senate Bill 375 is going to be carried out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which takes us away from our local responsibilities as well as dealing with all these unfunded mandates. Could someone address a little bit that interaction or that effect of all these state mandates that are piled on top of us, in addition to just taking care of our local jurisdictions? We've got to deal with all of that stuff.
Who's going to volunteer for that one?
Well, when they started regulating breastfeeding in public, I was done. They have a master list. I don't want to be critical, but they have a master list of pages of items that can be regulated, and they're working their way through them. In 1986, David Broder wrote just a brilliant piece that he called the demosclerosis, a middle-aged democratic system that had spent 200 years of incremental decision-making, piling law upon law, because that is the way our political system works. You never take anything away, you add to it. And after 200 years, he said, we're no longer capable of moving because our arteries have clogged. I thought it was just a brilliant explanation for where we are as a country, and I think that's part of it. We send people to Sacramento to do what? Legislate. There you go. I mean, that's what they're there for. And if they don't legislate, what are they going to do? So they have 1,200 bills?
Go ahead,
That's,
Tim.
that's exactly right. Two points that you made, I think, are right on the money. One is you never take anything away, and that's true in the sense of we've got a problem, we need to address it. Can we figure out the best way to address it? And instead of saying, well, the way that we're trying now doesn't work, let's do something different, we simply layer something new on top of it in an incremental fashion.
Right.
And the reason is that's because, except for the reasons you exactly say, that's what sells. That's the way in which the members of the legislature are able to sell themselves every time they have the election. And so as a consequence, it's just simply more and more and more. And, watching legislators in Sacramento, by and large, they haven't seen a bill that they don't like. And some of that, in my opinion, it'd be interesting to see, Maria, what your view is, given your particular position. Some of that, in my view, notwithstanding all of what we've said with respect to the fact that we are at each other in the way that David talked about earlier on, there isn't this ability to come together and build consensus. In some sense, though, in Sacramento, there's an excess of collegiality, which is the members will not vote against each other's bills unless they find them particularly objectionable from a philosophical perspective, or they're adverse to their own district's interests, because they want those members to vote aye on their bills. And so as a consequence, all this junk moves through the system now. In fact, there's somewhat less moving through now because the fiscal committees have started to say, look, there really is no money. We can't afford to do this. We're going to stop some of these bills. And certainly my attitude changed towards governors, because God bless them, they do actually veto bills, and some of them are really stupid. But there is a deeper problem here, as we've touched on. So that takes us a little far afield from your question about mandates. And, the voters, through the initiative process, at the behest of local government, have tried to change the dynamic by saying the state's got to reimburse for mandates, otherwise the mandate isn't going to be enforced. That process itself is broken because local governments, there's this constant pitched battle between local governments and state over the question of what's a mandate, what do we owe you. It's as Byzantine as anything that goes on in Sacramento, and so that's broken as well.
So I saw several hands up. I should Beth's going up again. I'll get you a second, Beth, but this gentleman here has been up many a time, so I'm going to start here.
Well, my question would be directed to Tim. You said earlier about...
You are?
My name is Bob Quaid. I'm with Wilden Financial Services. Your question that, your statement that, it sounded like you're saying bankruptcy is not an option. You can't resolve an agency, a government agency. But, we are all aware of there's Chapter 11 reorganization, and I'm trying to find out what options are on the table. How can you take that option off the table, whatever form that is for government, to reorganize some of these contracts that are killing, these pension contracts that are killing the state, some of these mandates, just reorganizing the state government in the way it operates financially, and trying to reduce some of the debt. It's a painful thing. For individuals, though, it's a way of getting out from under the heavy burden of debt. I went through it myself with personal bankruptcy back in the heyday of the 80s, when everybody thought nothing was ever going to go down and real estate was going to keep going up, and I made a lot of stupid decisions. But bankruptcy helped me get out from under that. My wife and I tried for years to do it. We finally had to go bankruptcy, and we started over. We worked our butts off, and we got back to where we were and even better. So I don't understand how that's not an option for government to just say, we screwed up. Let's try to wipe the slate clean as much as we can and move on. Start making it better. How can you say that that's not an option?
I think that's a question to you, Tim.
That's a great tool. It's a great tool, but it is not the same tool as an individual or a corporate entity has. Because our federal government has sculpted the tool differently for local governments. That is not to say, and I hope I didn't leave you with this impression, it sounds like I may have, that a restructuring of the relationship that our local governments have with some of their stakeholders. Again, my view as a practitioner is that we have stakeholders here. We have stakeholders who are citizens, not taxpayers. We have stakeholders who are employees. We have stakeholders who are vendors. We have stakeholders who are lenders to our local community. And when we put all of those stakeholders in the room and say, look, we have X number of dollars in resources, and we have Y number of dollars of need, the outcome has to be the kind of process that Maria has talked about, where people recognize that something will have to give. Now, I will say, because my point of view depends on where I sit, I help your local governments borrow money. The repudiation of debt, I think, is a very unwise and unsound decision. Because in the modern economy we operate in, all of us, you, I, our companies, our citizens, our cities, our states, our universities operate on credit. Imagine this. Imagine that if the state, many of you have probably read the various editorials, the state of California is going to go bankrupt. Well, for openers, the state of California doesn't even have access to the federal bankruptcy law. Okay, it's only applicable to local governments. But let's just assume for the moment that would be the case. Can you imagine the state would stand up and say it's going to repudiate $55 billion worth of debt that it's taken on? Okay, fat cat Wall Street bankers, you lose. Well, the problem is it isn't really the fat cat Wall Street bankers that lose. Many of us in this room probably have put money into a mutual fund, for example, that may own state of California bonds. But let's just assume that we go down that road and then say, now it's time to put gasoline in the highway patrol cars. So Tim's successor puts a line item in the budget for the CHP to put gasoline in the highway patrol cars, and Chevron says, you've just repudiated your debt, cash on delivery. Okay? I don't pay you unless you pay me cash. Apply that to the vendor who supplies the commissary at Pelican Bay. Now we're 72 hours away from social unrest because we've created this fiscal problem. So I don't think debt repudiation is the answer. Debt rescheduling may work. Debt rescheduling may work. Debt reorganization may work. Probably should be applied in some places that have overextended themselves. I'm focusing on that very narrow part of the balance sheet. The rest of it, union contracts, and I'm not here to take either side of the union question, but union contracts, post-employment benefits, retirement obligations, all of that sort of thing has to be put into the mix along with that if one's to get to a satisfactory answer.
Let me tell you, I'd like to just answer more in a practical way for you. I worked 10 years in the legislature, and during my 10 years with a member I work with, he had 3 jurisdictions go into bankruptcy. And that's where I cut my teeth on working with local elected officials on bankruptcy. 2 were hospitals, 1 was a school district. I want you to know, none of them were successful. If one that was too far along going bankruptcy lost their hospital, ended up only having a clinic. To this day, the people of that part of this county do not have adequate health care access because a board failed to restore their hospital services. Second hospital made a decision not to file bankruptcy. Over 2 decades, I'm talking now, every 10 years they were facing bankruptcy, but made a decision not to and kept that hospital alive. And to this day, that hospital is standing and serving the opposite end of that county. School district filed for bankruptcy. And this was during the time it was mentioned earlier, 1990-91. Those were really tough years for local governments, particularly schools. Was one of the first school districts to file for bankruptcy, Richmond Unified School District. And didn't get any. I'll tell you why the elected officials did it. They wanted to break their union contracts. They couldn't deal with their pension obligations and didn't know how to deal with them in terms of negotiations. Weren't successful negotiations. thought they were going to get blessing of a judge to break the contract, and they were going to not have any pain, no gain. No pain, no gain, right? What did the judge tell him? Go back and negotiate with your union. Put it in your financial plan. I am not breaking these contracts, nor am I going to break your vested rights on your pension plan. And I will tell you, they limped along as a difference for a long time. And believe me, I have some gray hair from bills and things I've carried for that district. And they changed their name after. But, you know, the structural issues, you know, it took them a long time to come out of it. So when my mayor said to me she wanted to file for bankruptcy, that was the last thing, not on my watch, when we were going to file for bankruptcy. And let me tell you why. When you go into bankruptcy court, what do? They ask you for a financial plan. You have to say what you are going to do to solve your problem. If you have a structural deficit, you got to tell them how you're going to fix it. If you have vendors and obligations, you have to say how you're going to pay your creditors. Okay? If you're going to have to do that to a judge, you might as well just do it yourself, save yourself the aggregation and the bad reputation and everything else, and just go through it. Now, it does mean you have to meet with your unions. So my mayor said, you don't want to file for bankruptcy? Then you're the one that has to meet with the unions. And we appoint you to go with our attorneys to renegotiate their contracts and their vested rights and change their pension rights. And here's my good story. I got to tell you.
She did it too.
And we did it. And we did it. But I want you to say how we did it. First thing I said when I met with the leadership was, I'm not here to break your defined benefit program. First. I'm not here for that. I'm here to work out with you how you can have, as workers, respect and good benefits, but benefits we can afford together and not be in bankruptcy. Okay? Second, if you don't believe this independent audit, we will open up the books and you can bring your independent auditor. And any money you can find, you can keep. That's how confident I was of every dime that we had and did not have. And I kept my word. When 6 unions went to a vote, 5 unions membership, you know, you have to vote to give up vested rights. Every member has a right to vote. 5 unions voted to give up vested rights on health care, on co-pay for pension. And we renegotiated their contracts for 3 years on top of that. 1 union refused. And I got to tell you, they're a powerful union. You have this on tape? I know they'll hear it. I give them my respect. The firefighters, I give my respect. I tip my hat off to them. Okay? They weren't going to make any changes. And they thought that they were going to intimidate the council not to do what we needed to do next when they refused. Under state law, we have some tools. One is state arbitration. We went to state arbitration. And you can be sure. That's right, Rusty, it failed, right? It failed, state arbitration. But my council came back, and on a unanimous vote, we changed their benefits under state law. We revocated their benefits under state law. My only problem was we could only do it legally for 1 year, and then we were back at the table again. It can be done. Yes, it can.
All right, good question. Bev in the back.
Here at the school, the European Center, and a recovering elected official. My question is, I think, for Rich Callahan, because you talked about leadership, and I think something that Maria said really struck me is the fact that having people who have some kind of background in government as you move up, but especially at a local elected official level. I know for our council there were some times when we didn't get along. We didn't know how to talk to one another. And Frank at the time actually was our city manager, and he brought some tools in for us to learn how to work together. And they really, really work. We learned how to respect one another. We may not have agreed with one another, but we learned how to respect one another, and we learned how each other process so that we could understand why one person just had to have every bit of data in the world, and I couldn't understand why she couldn't make a decision. She thought that I didn't read my stuff because I didn't make a decision like that. So we came to learn. And my question, Rich, is, because I know you've done a lot of work in this, I think the one thing we leave out is the thought that A lot of the people that run, most of the people who run for elected office at the local level have absolutely no background in any of the stuff we get into. You may have some, you may know about budgets, but you have no background. How can we help local electeds learn to be leaders? Just because you get elected doesn't mean you're a leader. And learn how to work with one another, because I think that's something we've left out, personally. That's why we have a lot of the fighting we do.
So I think there are several ways that we can respond to that. And one is a recognition, there needs to be a better recognition of when governmental systems, governance works well. And I'll go back to David's early remarks where he talked about essentially our Constitution being broken and businesses not looking for the common good. I actually think he has it exactly backwards. I think there are many cases that we can talk about that people can learn from. There's tremendous successes that we've had. If you look at Los Angeles today and you look outside, the air is literally cleaner than it was when the AQMD was set up. There's no writing about that. There's no societal learning from those examples. If you open Fast Company magazine, every year 25 companies they list throughout the world that do something for the, not something, do extraordinarily good for the common good. These examples are out there, but they're not in our public discourse. So the first response to Bev's question is, we really need to be conscious about our public discourse. We need to be conscious about what works and sharing what works. I mean, Ken Kaiser fixed the largest healthcare system in the United States to the point where the Wall Street Journal wrote the only favorable article I've ever seen about a public agency they wrote was on the Veterans Health Administration and how they solved IT in medical technology. No, we don't know about that. So when someone's elected to it, they don't know these examples are out there. We haven't done a good job societally. We haven't done a good job education. We haven't done a good job when we focus exclusively on these problems. Secondly, I think we focus too much on moving information. I've never really heard someone say at state government, and I've worked for LA County, for a member of the Board of Supervisors for 6 years. I worked with and around government officials in Sacramento. No one's ever said to me, we couldn't solve the problem because we couldn't get the spreadsheet right. The problem isn't Excel. The problem isn't data analytics. The problem isn't moving information. The problem is moving people and understanding. People understand issues differently, what Malcolm Gladwell calls the sociology of explanations. That someone can think differently and not be wrong. I mean, that's actually a problem, and I'll say, I mean, Fox TV, right? Okay, Fox Cable Network, all right? Or whatever the other side of the liberal thing is. If you think different, you're wrong. Well, we know people just process information differently. I think we're also lazy in our discourse. We talk about decision making as if there's one type of decision, right? Very different decision if a surgeon's making a decision as opposed to other types of decisions that lend themselves and are improved by discourse. We don't make those distinctions in discussion. So someone's elected, boom. They don't realize there's decisions that benefit from consultation, there's decisions that benefit from broad public input, and there's decisions that may not benefit from it. And decision making, you're not deciding, you're leading the decision making process. Two more things to think about. 3, 4, we don't think about, as we elect people, that there's other ways of learning. That you can take things from other disciplines and other practices and bring them in, but not wholesale, not just in a generality, but what's an idea that works? Oh, they figured this out at the federal level, base closure. It was a problem that was intractable. Could not close bases that the Department of Defense wanted closed. Someone figured out institutional arrangements to get that solved. Let's learn from those examples and walk them in. And the 5th and final point I bring up is put a premium on learning from experience. Now, any of us, when we take a new position, we think, let's invent the future. Let's reinvent the future. Let us trash all that's been done before us and make ourselves look great. Maybe none of you have done that. I've done it. Okay. We don't put a premium on how can we learn from experience. That actually, rather than being elected is a mandate to lead, it's an invitation to inquiry. It's an invitation to listening. So my colleagues, John King, Dave Logan, I'll finish up on this note, they have a formula. They say powerful leadership is created by powerful listening. If you want a great example of this, Nelson Mandela. What did he do in 26 years in prison? He learned the language of the people who are imprisoning him. He learned the language of Afrikaner. And he learned listening. But before we can get to him, this isn't the expectation. We elect people and we say, give us the answers. How would it go societally if we elected people and say, give us the questions? Powerful inquiry, creating powerful listening, then getting to powerful leadership.
Very good. I see several hands. I saw it. 1, 2, 3, and there'll be more. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Genti, and I'm a second-year policy student here, soon to be unemployed.
He means graduate.
But in our school, we prefer to say looking for employment. Throughout the year, we invite guest speakers to talk to us about issues, and a few weeks ago, we had Joe Tanner, the former city manager of Vallejo. And when we asked him about bankruptcy case in Vallejo and what were the causes, and he had one word, unions, police and fire unions. Mr. Kelly, you mentioned that we need to rethink services and we need to bring everybody onto the table to negotiate. And Ms. Ramonte, you mentioned how you have done that. But according to the Public Retirement Journal, they said over the last year there have been about 120 renegotiations, retirement benefits renegotiations, and only 7 of those have been related to reduced benefits. My first question is it hard for you to address the crisis issues, and are we missing the opportunity that you mentioned earlier? And a very quick one, is why cities are also opposing
That's 3. That's 2 already.
I want to mention the bankruptcy issue. Why are cities opposing the AB 155 that requires them to go in front of the CDAC and make their case for recession?
The issue of public safety, as I mentioned earlier, in a full-service city, they represent between 60 and 75% of the general fund. And depending upon the city, it can be a very strong union-oriented city, and they invest in the elections, and they therefore think in a lot of cases they own the city council. So extracting from them is difficult because of the economic connections. But I do argue that public safety departments can be cut. They always argue they can't. Everything they do is sacred. You've got to have X firefighters per day and X police officers per day. And to a point that's true, I'm a firefighter's son, it was ingrained in me, although I revolted later on. The issue is they can be cut. And the issue is the community has to come forward and say they're not sacred. That if you look at every single campaign by officials from the local to the state, federal, I'm in favor of public safety. It's a common thing. They wave the flag. But therefore, you reinforce the unions. And the analogy I draw is you look at the auto industry. The unions own the auto industry finally, so every car being made now, part of that fee goes to pay for the union benefits. And all those auto manufacturers are declining and dying. Police and fire cannot hold the community in a stranglehold. That's the problem. The community has to speak. And until they speak, the electeds are going to be afraid to sometimes react and take on the unions. I used to teach at the LA County Fire Chiefs Academy, and I was the question, should unions participate in local elections? And I said, you have the right to do that. I just have to make sure you pick the winners, because if you choose the losers, they will get even. And I think your example of the firefighter refused to come to the table and negotiate, you can take it away from them. You can unilaterally reconstruct their operation. You will get their attention. And for the councils that fail to confront that impact, they're not in control of their city. They're not as strong as they perceive they are. And I challenge councils to take them on.
Thank you. Barry Waite, Business Development Manager for the City of Carson, and I'm also a fellow recovering politician, so maybe the two of us can get together for a meeting later. But what I found as an elected official, and I'd already been in public service for 20 years when I ran for office, but what I found was how hard it was to get people engaged in a positive fashion. I could do it one person at a time. Take the crankiest, and we had the crankiest people in our town of Lomita, 20,000, and one-on-one, I could work with them. But you know what? Even in a town of 20,000, you can't make much headway one at a time. How can we get people re-engaged? I think David Jansen's right on that somehow we just have a disconnect at this point between government and public, of the public, groups calling themselves taxpayers instead of citizens, recognizing we're all taxpayers too, but how do we get people engaged? And I won't even say re-engaged, I'm not sure we ever were. I think people used to just say, oh, the government will take care of me, and now they're thinking the same thing, but they say, yeah, the government's going to take care of me, all right. What do we do?
Any responses?
Well, I'll try. I'll introduce it, and then you guys can add in. But just my own experience with communities is that in order to engage the public, it's got to be not just one or two people. It's got to be a group of folks who represent different perspectives and interests that might be in the community sectors that can work with you as far as in getting folks engaged. First, agreeing why to get them engaged, what you would focus on, what the desired outcome and product of that would be, and then working together as far as there's different methodologies that you can utilize to get them to the table. Now, the other thing, too, is when you get them to the table is the process that you utilize cannot be, what I find is, you know those healthcare forums that they tried to have that where people were acted like goofballs and they were actually rewarded acting that way, behaving that way. So much of it was just the process in which it was set up, how it was set up. The questions that were asked, how it was done. My own experience has been, if you set it up in a certain way, get them in a certain mind frame, because you want it to be not negative, you want it to be positive. There's a certain way that you can do that, in which by having an engagement in that way, it creates a different type of atmosphere and environment. But you also, that's all a workshop all on its own. But I have seen where when you have it set up for success in a certain way, even on these tough budget issues, you can do it in a way that is very engaging and very effective.
If you look at the budget issues as one example, we did a series of family room dialogues where we asked 20 people in the community to invite their neighbors and family to their family room. And we, as staff, came and we talked about, what was important in the community and what we were going to fund and what were the hard choices. And there's a lot of great resources. The National Civic League has a lot of great resources. Institute of Local Government has a lot of great resources. Common Sense California has just developed a whole set of tools about civic engagement. There's a lot of approaches and tools out there. But again, it's going to take elected officials, appointed officials, to say, hey, we have to, these problems are so intractable, we have to engage the whole community in having those kinds of hard conversations that Maria talked about.
My city has structured what they call a neighborhood council structure, started in the 60s and 70s across the city. This council actually, any development that happens in that neighborhood has to go before that council first for discussion and highlighting. That's tough. Those are land use decisions, You get people that want to have a say about your porch and your addition and your, a large complex project, but they have input at that level. In 1994, we instituted community policing in our city, and that's been transferred into our community neighborhood council structure, which problem solves around crime, graffiti, basically quality of life issues. So people are engaged on issues all the time. So when an emergency like this happens, you have a structure in which to do neighborhood level, door to door. These people walk door to door to invite people to their neighborhood council meeting every month.
And also,
we have a staff structure.
Engagement's a longer-term process too. You have to, if you do it, you have to show the results. There has to be results, and that gives folks more momentum for the next time you do it, for that type of participation. But again, setting it up is so key. You have to, the ones that I have found that have been the most successful, we've taken a lot of time to look at how it is set up, how you recruit, how you get people there, thinking through a lot of the pre-planning and the thinking, setting up yourself up for success. I guess that's what you put it.
Mark Pisano, Senior Fellow at USC. The last several comments started to touch on the issue that I would like both the same individuals and the rest of the panel to address, and that is how do we in government think differently about what we're doing so that we can in fact be different at the end of the day. Where you said we're going to be a different city. That was a general comment. Tim, you said that the state's going to have 5 or even more years of this and it's going to be different. So my question is beyond the processes, Gary, that you spoke about, and Maria, that you spoke about, how is it that we start to think differently about what it is that government's going to be so that we in fact can relate our expenditures with our revenues?
So I don't know if you all heard in the back, but the question was, how do we start down this path of thinking of ourselves differently that will allow us to be different?
Well, it gets back to Rich. What
And by the way, the management issues of being more efficient, we've learned isn't going to cut.
Right.
So the question then becomes, how do we start thinking so that we can cut it?
Well, it gets back to this, the underlying theme we've been talking about, which is leadership, not management. And how do we courageously confront our situation and basically rally people? This is the engagement piece. How do we rally people towards a better future? And that takes passion, it takes will, it takes energy, it takes emotion. But that's what it's all about. It's at the elected level, at the appointed level, and it's, again, not management. Management is good. We need great management, but we need also some great, passionate leadership as well.
I think Tim Schaefer said it when he said, begin with the end in mind. Mm-hmm. That really is it. In my little handout, I have stages, and I can't tell you how important these stages are. And some of them are simultaneous, and that's also important that they're simultaneous. But to understand the steps you have to go through, here you're dealing with the crisis. When somebody tells you in less than 4 months you're going to run out of cash, you can't meet payroll, you got 120 days to fix a problem to not run out of payroll, okay? If you're talking about recovery, you're talking about 18 to 24 months. If you're talking about what your city's going to look like in the future, that has to be a part of the conversation, even while you're dealing with the present crisis. And that's what we did. We went out and did town hall meetings. We used our neighborhood structure. I went to every neighborhood council meeting. There are 37 of them, to explain how we got here, why we're here, and what options we have, and have to listen to people be angry about it. And I ask the question over and over again, how do you see this city? What do you think it's going to look like when we only have somewhere between 800 and 1,000 employees? What is important to you as a core service to keep? And what are the standards we're going to have when we establish those services? What does it look like to you? And those conversations, believe me, we're still unfolding in this process. Because some people say, well, you haven't finished fixing this yet. But I think having a vision for what is sustainable, what speaks to you as the right kind of city to serve your citizens, and what's the quality of life, the safety and quality of life you want as a city, that's what matters. And that's what determines what you do. If people decide they want a higher level of service, then you have to figure out how to pay for it. That's just the bottom line.
I'd say the university has a big role to play in it.
On that score, though, I'm going to say we've been going for over 2 hours. We've got a fantastic panel and a great audience sitting with us. You want everybody to answer, I know, but what I want to say is that I think that we're going to carry this conversation out to the reception, where we can continue the dialogue and let them off the hook.